Welcome, settle in, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries with me tonight. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey into a world vastly different from your own. We're traveling to medieval France, to a time when the rhythm of life moved to the seasons, when the horizon beyond your village might as well have been the edge of the world, and when survival itself was never guaranteed. Tonight, we'll walk alongside those who lived through one of Europe's longest conflicts, the 100 Years' War. We'll experience the daily texture of peasant life, not through the lens of kings and knights, but through the eyes of those who tilled the soil, those whose names were never recorded in chronicles, whose voices were never heard in councils of state. We'll witness extraordinary events and ordinary hardships alike, always returning to that fundamental question: what was it truly like? The stories we explore tonight span generations. They encompass the mundane and the miraculous, the grinding poverty and the fleeting moments of hope. As you listen, allow the details to wash over you. There's no need to remember everything, no test awaiting you. Simply let yourself be present in these distant moments, and when sleep comes, let it come. Our journey begins in the fields of northern France, where the earth is cold and the sky is grey. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a small village in the Île-de-France, perhaps 50 miles from Paris. The year is 1346. Though you wouldn't know it by that number, time moves differently for you, marked by saints' days and harvest seasons rather than the progression of years. Your name might be Jacques or perhaps Guillaume. It doesn't matter much. In the records that survive, if your name appears at all, it will be in a list of those who owed taxes or those who died. Your world begins at the door of your cottage. It's a small structure, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with walls of wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung. The thatched roof above you needs repair. It always needs repair. Water drips through in several places during rain, and you've grown accustomed to the steady plinking sound into wooden buckets positioned throughout your home. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. In the corner, a shallow pit holds the dying embers of last night's fire, the only source of heat for your family. The smoke, and there is always smoke, rises through a simple hole in the roof. Your eyes have adjusted to it over the years, though they water still on particularly smoky days. The smell is perpetual. Wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal dung from the cow that shares one end of your dwelling, the sour tang of the straw you sleep on. You share this space with your wife, your 3 children, and that cow. The cow is perhaps your most valuable possession, more valuable than your wooden plough, more valuable than the cooking pot, more valuable certainly than the rough wool garments you wear. When the cow is healthy, there is milk. When there is milk, your children's bellies are fuller. When the cow sickens, as it did 2 winters ago, you watch helplessly as your youngest grows thinner, his eyes becoming too large for his small face. But this morning, the cow is alive, and so are you, and so are your children. That is enough. That is more than many can say. You step outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air is thick with moisture, carrying the scent of damp earth and the acrid smoke from other cottages in your village. There are perhaps 40 such homes here, clustered loosely around a rutted track that optimistically calls itself a road. Beyond the village lie the fields, the open fields that define your existence as surely as the walls of your cottage. The fields stretch in long, narrow strips, each one approximately an acre. You hold several of these strips, scattered throughout the 3 great fields that surround your village. This scattering is not by choice, but by ancient custom, ensuring that every family has a mix of good soil and poor wet land and dry. Your best strip lies in the south field, where the soil is dark and fertile. Your worst is in the low-lying eastern field, where water pools after every rain and the wheat grows sparse and sickly. You are not free. The distinction matters, though perhaps not as much as lords would have you believe. You are a serf, bound to this land by obligations that stretch back further than anyone can remember. You cannot leave without permission from your lord. You cannot marry without his consent. You owe him labor. 3 days each week you must work his domain, the land he keeps for himself. You owe him a portion of your harvest. You owe him fees when you grind your grain at his mill, bake your bread in his oven. You owe him taxes at Christmas, at Easter, at harvest time. In exchange, theoretically, he owes you protection. But it is 1346, and the English have landed in Normandy. The news reaches your village slowly, carried by a priest traveling from the nearest town, repeated by a peddler who passes through selling needles and ribbon. King Edward of England has brought an army across the narrow sea. They are somewhere to the north. They are moving south. They are burning everything in their path. You've heard of wars before. Wars are what lords do, incomprehensible conflicts over incomprehensible claims to incomprehensible territories. They happen far away, in castles and in cities. They don't happen here, in your fields, in your village, except this war is different. The strategy the English employ has a name, though you'll never hear it, chevauchée. It's a deliberate, systematic campaign of destruction, aimed not at conquering territory but at devastating it. The goal is to demonstrate the enemy king's inability to protect his subjects, to destroy his tax base, to terrorize the population into submission. Villages like yours are not incidental casualties. You are the target. The first you know of it is the smoke. You're in the south field, bent double with your wooden hoe, breaking up the soil around your wheat plants. It's late August, and the wheat is nearly ready for harvest. You've been watching the heads of grain carefully, waiting for that perfect moment when they're full but not yet scattering. This harvest will determine whether your family eats through the winter. There is no margin for error, no stored surplus from previous years. You exist always on the edge of hunger, and a single failed harvest means starvation. Someone shouts. You straighten. Your back protests. It always protests, and turn toward the sound. To the north, perhaps 5 miles distant, a column of smoke rises into the summer sky. It's too large to be a single house fire, too large to be accidental. Your stomach contracts with a fear you've never quite felt before. You've experienced fear many times, fear of hunger, fear of the Lord's bailiff, fear of sickness. But this is different. This is immediate and primal. Other villagers are emerging from the fields now, all watching that smoke. Nobody speaks. The sound of the world seems to have contracted to the whisper of wind through wheat and your own heartbeat, loud in your ears. The decision, when it comes, is not really a decision. You run. Your wife is in the cottage with the children. You find them quickly, give instructions in a voice that sounds steadier than you feel. Take nothing. No, leave it. Now. The village empties within the hour. 40 families, perhaps 200 souls, flowing toward the forest that lies beyond the western fields. It's ancient forest, dense and dark. And under normal circumstances, you would never venture far into it. There are wolves in that forest. There are outlaws. There are spirits, perhaps, or worse things. But today, the forest represents safety, and you push into the undergrowth with your family close behind you. The forest floor is soft with centuries of leaf fall. Branches tangle overhead, filtering the sunlight into a dim green twilight. You move without a path, pushing deeper, always deeper. Your youngest son whimpers. The branches scratch his face, and he's frightened, but you cannot stop. Around you, you're dimly aware of your neighbors doing the same. Families fragmenting into the trees, each seeking their own hiding place. You find a spot eventually, a small hollow beneath an outcropping of stone, screened by dense bushes. You pull your family into this space, and you wait. The waiting is worse than the running. Hours pass. The forest around you is alive with small sounds. Birds calling, leaves rustling, branches creaking. Every sound makes you flinch. Your wife holds the baby close to her chest, one hand pressed over his mouth to muffle any cries. Your older children sit motionless, eyes wide with a fear they don't fully understand. You can see nothing from your hiding place. You can hear nothing that tells you what's happening in the village. The not knowing becomes its own form of torture. Did they pass by? Did they find the village empty and move on? Or are they there now, in your home, taking what little you have? Night falls. You haven't eaten since morning. Your children are hungry. They're always hungry, but this is different. You have no food with you, no water. You remain hidden regardless. The next morning brings an end to uncertainty. You emerge cautiously from the forest with the sunrise, joining other villagers who have survived the night. Together, you approach your village. The smoke is visible long before you reach it. That particular smell, burning thatch, burning timber, the acrid stench of destruction, carries on the morning breeze. Your village no longer exists. The cottages have been burned, every single one. The roofs have collapsed inward, leaving only charred timbers and crumbling walls. The manor house, the Lord's residence, is similarly destroyed. The church still stands, being stone, but its wooden door has been smashed and the interior ransacked. You walk through the ruins in a daze. Other villagers move like ghosts through the smoke, searching for anything salvageable. There is almost nothing. The cow is gone, stolen or slaughtered, you'll never know which. Your wooden plough is broken, deliberately smashed. The few pots and implements you owned are scattered and destroyed. But worst of all, the fields. You walk to the south field, to your best strip, where yesterday morning you were tending wheat that was nearly ready for harvest. The wheat has been trampled, deliberately, systematically trampled by horses, ridden back and forth across the field until not a single stalk remains standing. Where hooves have not reached, fire has. Blackened stubble is all that remains of your winter's survival. You stand in the ruins of your crop and feel something break inside you. It's not dramatic. There are no tears, no cries of anguish. It's simply a quiet internal collapse. The understanding that everything you've worked for is gone. The hunger that was always a possibility has now become an inevitability. This scene, your scene, is repeated thousands of times across northern France in the summer and autumn of 1346. The English army moves through the countryside like a locust plague, destroying systematically and thoroughly. They are not here to conquer, they are here to devastate. The army moves on. Eventually you hear they met the French army at a place called Crécy, and there was a great battle. The French lost. Many nobles died. Edward's longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry. This means nothing to you. Your concern is survival. The village begins to rebuild. It's a slow, painful process. The Lord provides some assistance. He needs tax-paying serfs, after all, but it's minimal. New cottages are constructed, cruder than before. New roofs are thatched. You borrow tools from neighboring villages that were spared. You plant what little seed grain remains, saving it from your meager food supply, hoping it will yield a harvest next year. But next year's harvest is a year away. The winter of 1346 to 1347 is a nightmare of hunger. You know hunger. You've always known hunger. But this is different. This is not the gnawing, constant background hunger of peasant life. The hunger that means you go to bed with your stomach never quite full. That means you eat bread made partially from ground acorns or peas, mixed with wheat to stretch the grain. This is starvation. Your family has almost nothing. The grain you manage to save from the trampled fields is barely enough for seed. You eat once a day, sometimes less. Thin porridge, made from whatever you can find. You forage in the forest for roots, for berries long past their season, for anything edible. You strip bark from certain trees and boil it until it's soft enough to chew. You catch what small animals you can, though you're competing with every other desperate soul in the region. Your children cry from hunger. Your youngest, the baby, grows thinner. Your wife's milk dries up. She hasn't enough food herself to produce it. You watch your family wasting away, and there is nothing you can do. Nothing. The baby dies in January. He simply doesn't wake up one morning, his small body cold beside his mother. You bury him in the frozen ground behind the ruined church, in a grave barely 2 feet deep, because the earth is too hard to dig deeper. There's no priest to say words over him. The priest left months ago seeking safety in a walled town. You are not alone in your loss. The winter takes many, the very young, the very old, those already weakened by previous hardships. By spring, your village's population has shrunk by a quarter, but you survive. Somehow, you survive. Spring brings new planting and autumn brings a small harvest. It's not enough, it's never enough, but it's something. Life continues because it must. The rhythm of the agricultural year reasserts itself. You plant, you tend, you harvest, you pay your taxes, you fulfill your labor obligations, the world continues. And then, a few years later, they come again. This time it's not the English but French routiers, disbanded mercenaries, soldiers without employment who have formed themselves into roving bands. They're nominally French, but they prey on French villages as readily as English soldiers ever did. In some ways, they're worse. The English came, destroyed, and moved on. The routiers linger. They arrive at your village in the autumn of 1351. There are perhaps 30 of them, armed men on horses. Your lord and his soldiers are nowhere to be seen. Fled to a fortified town at the first warning, you are defenseless. The routiers demand food. You give them what you have. It's not enough. They demand money. You have no money. They search the village, taking anything of value. When they find your cow, you've managed to acquire another cow in the years since the last disaster. They slaughter it on the spot, roasting the meat over fires built from your furniture. They stay for 3 days. During those 3 days, you and your family hide as best you can. You learn to recognize the sound of their boots, to disappear before they can find you, to demand more work, more food, more of whatever they desire. Some villagers are beaten for not producing what they don't have. Some houses are burned again, seemingly for entertainment. One young woman from the village, a girl you've known since childhood, is taken. She doesn't return. When the routiers finally leave, gorged and bored, they fire several more cottages behind them because they can. Because destruction is their language, their power, their purpose. And you begin again, again. You rebuild, you replant, you survive. This becomes the pattern of your life. The war, the great incomprehensible war between kings, continues for decades. It will continue long after you die. You will never see peace, not truly. The intervals between disasters grow shorter. English armies, French armies, mercenary bands, bandits who are indistinguishable from soldiers. Each wave strips the countryside a little more bare. The taxation grows worse. Your lord needs money to pay soldiers, to repair fortifications, to send to the king for the war effort. You pay hearth taxes, salt taxes, sales taxes. You pay tithes to the church. You pay fees and fines and obligations. The amount of your harvest that remains yours shrinks year by year. In 1358, something breaks. The peasants of your region rise in rebellion. The jacquerie, they call it, after the name Jacques, the contemptuous term nobles use for peasants. For a few brief weeks, the oppressed become oppressors. Castles are stormed, nobles are killed, the social order inverts itself. You watch this happen, but you don't participate. You're too tired, too broken by years of simply surviving. And you can see what others cannot, that this rebellion will fail. The nobles have armor, horses, weapons, training. Peasants have scythes and fury. Fury alone is not enough. The rebellion is crushed within weeks. The reprisals are brutal. Thousands are killed. The nobles hunt down rebels with systematic thoroughness, hanging them from trees, drowning them in rivers. The survivors are subject to new taxes, new obligations, punishment for the whole region because of what some did. Your life grows harder still. Disease comes in 1361, a return of the plague that had devastated Europe 13 years earlier. Your village, already weakened by repeated raids and near-constant hunger, is especially vulnerable. The plague moves through like fire through dry grass. You lose your wife. You lose one of your remaining children. You survive, but survival feels less like victory with each passing year. By the 1370s, you're an old man. You're perhaps 45, which is ancient by the standards of your class. Your body is broken by decades of brutal labor and inadequate food. Your back is permanently bent. Your hands are twisted with what you don't know is arthritis. Your teeth, what remain of them, ache constantly. You work still because you must. You have one surviving son, now grown, working the same fields you worked, carrying the same burdens. He will pass them to his sons, in turn. The war continues. It has always continued. It will always continue. You remember sometimes what the priest said once, that there would be peace in heaven, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. You're not certain you believe it anymore. Heaven feels very distant. The mud beneath your feet feels immediate and real. On a cold morning in 1383, you don't wake up. Your son finds you in your cottage, your body finally surrendered to decades of accumulated hardship. You're buried in the churchyard, in an unmarked grave that will be forgotten within a generation. Your life was not exceptional. That's the terrible truth of it. Your suffering was ordinary, replicated in thousands of villages across France over more than a century. The 100 Years' War was fought between kings and decided by nobles. But it was endured by people like you, people whose names appear in no chronicles, whose voices were never recorded, whose daily struggle to simply continue living was never considered worthy of documentation. The rhythm of your life was defined by fear and hunger and loss. The brief intervals between disasters were not peace, but merely pauses, moments to draw breath before the next catastrophe. You survived because humans can survive almost anything, can adapt to almost any horror, but survival is not the same as living. When modern historians discuss the 100 Years' War, they speak of battles and sieges, of diplomatic maneuvers and dynastic claims. They speak of Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, of the heights of chivalry and the evolution of military technology. These things matter. They shaped nations and altered the course of European history. But beneath those grand narratives were millions of lives like yours. Small lives, grinding lives, lives defined by their proximity to violence they had no part in creating and no power to stop. You were the collateral damage of someone else's ambitions. Your village, your crops, your family, your very life were expendable resources to be burned or taxed or destroyed in service of conflicts you would never understand. This was your reality. This was what it meant to be a peasant during the 100 Years' War. The helplessness was total, the suffering was immense, and through it all, you endured, because endurance was the only option available to you. Let us move now from the fields to the city walls, from the nameless peasant to events that would echo through centuries. The year is 1428, and we turn our attention to Orleans, a city that has become, almost by accident of geography, the pivot upon which the fate of France will turn. Picture Orleans from above, as a bird might see it, spreading along the northern bank of the Loire River. The Loire curves in a wide, languid arc, its waters reflecting the pale autumn sky. The city itself is prosperous by the standards of the age, home to perhaps 30,000 souls, protected by substantial walls and towers, connected to the south bank by a fortified bridge that has stood for centuries. The bridge is crucial. Control the bridge, control the crossing. Control the crossing, control access to southern France. By October 1428, English forces have surrounded the city, but we should understand what this means and what it doesn't mean. A medieval siege is not the tight, complete encirclement you might imagine. The English army numbers perhaps 5,000 men, not nearly enough to seal every approach to a city the size of Orleans. Instead, they construct a ring of fortifications, bastilles they're called, wooden towers and earthwork forts positioned at strategic points around the city. Each bastille is garrisoned with soldiers. Between them stretch the gaps, the spaces where the siege is porous, where supplies can sometimes slip through, where hope can be maintained. Imagine yourself within the city walls as autumn turns to winter. You're not a peasant now, but perhaps a merchant, someone who has known comfort, whose concerns until recently involved the price of wool and the quality of wine. Your house is substantial, 2 stories of timber and plaster with glazed windows, a luxury, and a proper hearth in every room. But comfort is becoming memory. The English bastilles tighten around the city like a noose drawn slowly closed. The bridge, the crucial bridge, has been partially destroyed. English forces hold the Tourelles, the fortified gatehouse at the southern end, transforming what was once the city's greatest strength into a position from which they can attack the walls themselves. Food is rationed. The granaries are full for now, but everyone understands that this is temporary wealth. If the siege continues through winter and into spring, hunger will come. It always comes. You've heard stories from other sieges, other cities. You know what awaits if relief doesn't arrive. The rhythm of life adapts to the siege. Days are measured not by bells calling workers to their trades, but by the irregular percussion of bombardment. The English have brought cannon, relatively new weapons, crude and unreliable but capable of terrifying destruction. The sound is like thunder, except thunder promises cleansing rain. This promises only stone and iron, crashing through roofs, through walls, through flesh when someone is unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. You learn to judge the sounds. A distant boom means the shot will fall elsewhere. A closer report sends you scrambling for shelter. At night, you can see the glowing trajectories of fire arrows, arcing over the walls, seeking thatched roofs to ignite. The city maintains bucket brigades, citizens organized to fight fires before they can spread. You take your turn with the buckets, passing them hand to hand, the water sloshing, your arms aching, the heat of nearby flames making your face tight and dry. The psychological weight of the siege is exhausting, in ways that physical labor never is. You cannot escape it. Even when the bombardment pauses, the knowledge of the enemy outside the walls presses down on you. Every decision must account for it. Do you spend money on food now, or save it against worse times to come? Do you send your daughter to fetch water from the well? Necessary work, but it requires crossing exposed areas where English archers might have line of sight. The city's defenders are a mixed force. Some are professional soldiers, men-at-arms in the service of noble commanders. Others are citizens like yourself, organized into militia companies, armed with whatever can be found. Crossbows, pikes, simple spears. You train one afternoon each week in a square near your home, learning to hold formation, to respond to shouted commands. You're not good at it. Your body doesn't remember the movements quickly enough. But you try, because what else can you do? The winter of 1428 to 1429 is bitter. Cold seeps through walls, through shuttered windows, through every gap and crack. Fuel for fires is rationed like everything else. You wear every garment you own, layer upon layer, and still you shiver. The cold makes the hardship of siege worse. The English in their bastilles suffer too. This is small comfort, but you take it anyway. Food supplies dwindle, the rations shrink, meat becomes rare then absent. You eat bread and thin soup and you're grateful for it because you know others have less. The poor quarters of the city are suffering far worse than your neighborhood. Disease follows malnutrition as surely as night follows day. You hear of deaths, always more deaths. The bodies are buried quickly without ceremony in pits dug in waste ground near the walls. Spring arrives, but brings no relief. If anything, the siege intensifies. English reinforcements have arrived. New bastilles are constructed, tightening the noose further. The food situation grows critical. The city's commanders send urgent messages to the Dauphin, the uncrowned King Charles VII, whose legitimacy is contested, whose will is weak, who governs from Chinon and seems paralyzed by indecision. The messages say, send help, send an army, send anything. Orléans cannot hold indefinitely. The replies, when they come, are vague promises and empty reassurances. And then, in late April 1429, rumors begin to circulate. A girl is coming, a peasant girl, they say, barely 17 years old, who claims she hears voices, saints' voices, who claims God has sent her to save France, who has somehow convinced the Dauphin to give her soldiers' armor, a banner. You hear these rumors and think, madness. The strain of the siege has affected someone, or this is propaganda, or this is a cruel joke. A peasant girl playing at soldier? It's absurd. But the rumors persist and grow more specific. She's real. Her name is Joan from a village called Domremy. She's on her way to Orléans with a relief force. She will break the siege. On the evening of April 29th, 1429, she arrives. You're not present at the gate when she enters. Only soldiers and officials are there, but you hear about it within hours. The city erupts in a strange, desperate excitement. People crowd the streets hoping for a glimpse of this mysterious figure. You join the crowd, pushed along by the current of bodies, and there, moving through the press of people, you see her. She's smaller than you expected, young, so young that calling her a girl seems more accurate than calling her a woman. She wears armor that must have been made for someone else, doesn't quite fit. She rides a black horse with surprising confidence for someone of her background, but it's her face that arrests you. She looks certain. There's no other word for it. In a city that has spent months marinated in fear and doubt, she radiates absolute conviction. She carries a banner, white, emblazoned with fleur-de-lis and the names of Jesus and Mary. She doesn't carry it like a standard bearer performing a duty. She carries it like it matters, like it means something beyond cloth and symbols. The crowd presses close, calling out to her, reaching to touch her horse, her banner, her armor. She acknowledges them with a serious nod but doesn't smile, doesn't play to the crowd. She's focused on something beyond the immediate moment, her gaze directed toward the walls, toward the English positions beyond. Over the next days, she does what seems impossible. She participates in councils with the military commanders, experienced soldiers who should dismiss her, but somehow don't. She insists on immediate action against the English bastilles. The commanders argue for caution, for waiting for more reinforcements. She argues for faith and boldness. She wins the arguments, perhaps not through eloquence. Her language is simple, direct, the language of a peasant, but through sheer force of conviction. When she speaks of her voices, of her certainty that God wills French victory, grown men who have spent lifetimes in warfare find themselves believing, or at least they find themselves unable to refuse her. On May 4th, the French forces, with Joan in their midst carrying her banner, assault the Bastille of Saint-Loup. You watch from the walls, your heart hammering as soldiers pour out of the city gates. The English position is strong, reinforced with ditches and palisades. The assault should fail. These things usually fail. It doesn't fail. After hours of fighting, after casualties, you can see accumulating even from this distance. Men falling, bodies remaining motionless on the ground. The Bastille is taken. The French plant their banners on its walls. The English defenders who survive are captured or killed. The city celebrates that night with the kind of desperate joy that comes from seeing hope materialize into reality. You join your neighbors in the streets, sharing wine that someone has hoarded for months, laughing too loudly, crying without quite understanding why. But Joan doesn't celebrate. You see her later that evening, walking through the streets, her face troubled. Someone says she wept for the English dead. You don't know if this is true, but it sounds true. There's something about her that suggests she understands the cost of what's happening, even as she remains utterly convinced of its necessity. The assaults continue. On May 5th, May 6th, the French forces attack other bastilles. Joan is always present, not fighting directly. The chronicles will later say she didn't wield a sword in battle, but carrying her banner, urging soldiers forward, her presence itself a kind of weapon. Men fight harder when she's watching. They take risks they wouldn't otherwise take. They believe because she believes that victory is certain. You watch these battles from the walls when you can, though often the fighting is too distant or too obscured by smoke to see clearly. What you can see are the results. English positions fall. The noose loosens. Supply lines open. Food enters the city again. Not abundance, but enough. The crucial moment comes on May 7th. The target is the Tourelle, the fortified gatehouse controlling the southern end of the bridge. It's the strongest English position, defended by experienced soldiers, protected by the river itself and by multiple layers of fortification. Taking it should be impossible. The assault begins at dawn. You're in the militia now, stationed on the walls, ordered to create diversions, to prevent English reinforcements from other bastilles reaching the Tourelles. You loose crossbow bolts toward distant targets, not really expecting to hit anything, just contributing to the general chaos and noise of battle. But your attention keeps pulling toward the bridge, toward the Tourelle. You can see French soldiers crowding onto the partially destroyed spans, trying to bring ladders forward under withering fire from the defenders. Men fall into the river. Some don't surface. The assault seems to be faltering. And then you see Joan. She's climbed a scaling ladder against the wall of a forward fortification. She's visible against the stonework, banner in one hand. She's shouting something you can't hear from this distance. And then, abruptly, she falls. An arrow or a crossbow bolt, you can't tell which, has struck her. She tumbles backward off the ladder and disappears from view. The assault stops. For long minutes, confusion reigns. The French soldiers begin to pull back. You feel your heart sinking. It's over. She's dead. The miracle has ended. But then, and you'll remember this moment for the rest of your life, she reappears. She's wounded clearly, one hand pressed to her shoulder where blood seeps between the joints of her armor. But she's alive, and she's being helped back toward the fortifications. The soldiers around her are rallying, finding courage in her survival. The assault resumes with renewed fury. It continues through the afternoon, a grinding, brutal affair where yards are won and lost repeatedly. You watch until your eyes ache from the strain of trying to see details at such distance. As the sun begins to set, something shifts. The English defense begins to crumble. French soldiers pour over the walls of the Tourelle. The English standard is pulled down. The French banner and Joan's white banner with its lilies and holy names are raised in its place. The siege is broken. That night the English forces abandon their remaining bastilles and withdraw. By morning, they're gone. The siege of Orleans, which has lasted more than 6 months, is over. The city has survived. France has survived. Joan remains in Orleans for a few days, receiving honors, attending masses, but always with that same serious demeanor, that sense of focus on something beyond the immediate celebration. She speaks of continuing the campaign, of crowning the Dauphin at Reims, of driving the English from France entirely. She speaks with the same certainty she brought to Orleans, the same conviction that what she says is not hope, but inevitable fact. And impossibly, over the following weeks, her predictions continue to unfold. In June, French forces under her influence capture Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency. At Patay, the French army defeats a larger English force decisively. These are not marginal victories. These are catastrophic defeats for the English, shattering their aura of invincibility that has persisted since Agincourt 14 years earlier. In July, she achieves her stated goal. The Dauphin is crowned as King Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, the traditional coronation site of French kings. Joan stands nearby during the ceremony, her banner in hand. In the space of 3 months, she has transformed the trajectory of the war. What seemed impossible in April is accomplished by July. But now the momentum begins to slow. The newly crowned king, no longer motivated by urgent necessity, grows cautious. He negotiates truces, considers diplomatic solutions. Joan argues for pressing the advantage, for attacking Paris, for maintaining the offensive. She's increasingly ignored. In September, an assault on Paris fails. Joan is wounded again. The king orders a withdrawal. The army disperses for winter. Joan is left without clear purpose, her mission incomplete, her certainty meeting the immovable reality of political calculation. The following spring, she continues fighting, but now in smaller campaigns, without royal support. In May 1430, at the town of Compiègne, she's captured by Burgundian forces, Burgundians being French nobles allied with the English. She's sold to the English for 10,000 gold crowns, the price of a miracle. The trial that follows is a careful, deliberate destruction. It's conducted by the Bishop of Cauchon, a French cleric loyal to the English cause. The goal is clear from the beginning, to demonstrate that Joan's victories were not divinely inspired, but demonic, that she is a heretic and a witch, that everything she accomplished was illegitimate. The trial lasts months. Joan, imprisoned in an English fortress, is questioned repeatedly by theologians and clerics. The transcripts that survive reveal someone remarkable, uneducated but intelligent, trapped by questions designed to have no good answers, but maintaining her essential claims. Yes, she hears voices. Yes, they are saints. Yes, God sent her to save France. She's illiterate, isolated, facing men who have spent lifetimes studying theology and law. She has no advocate, no defender. The outcome is predetermined. The trial is theater, a performance of legitimacy meant to justify what has already been decided. They focus particularly on her wearing of men's clothing and armor. This becomes the technical heresy they need. In medieval theology, cross-dressing violated divine order, suggested a rejection of God's plan. Joan argues simply, wearing men's clothing was practical for a soldier, necessary for her mission. The judges are unmoved. In May 1431, 13 months after her capture, she briefly recants. Faced with the threat of immediate execution, exhausted by months of imprisonment and questioning, she signs a document she cannot read, agreeing that her voices were deceptions. In exchange, her sentence is commuted to life imprisonment. But days later, she's found wearing men's clothing again. Whether this was her choice, a return to the truth she'd briefly abandoned, or a trap set by her captors, who deliberately left only men's clothes available, is debated. It doesn't matter. A relapsed heretic has no hope of mercy. On May 30th, 1431, Joan is burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She's 19 years old. The execution is public, designed to be witnessed, to serve as warning and as closure. A crowd gathers, some hostile, some sympathetic, many simply curious. Joan is led to the stake, wearing a long white garment, a paper cap on her head inscribed with her crimes. Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. She asks for a cross. Someone fashions one from 2 pieces of wood and gives it to her. She holds it before her face as the flames are lit. France's miracle dies in fire and fear and political calculation. The war continues. Charles VII, whom she crowned, does nothing to save her. The men who fought beside her, who witnessed her certainty and her impossible victories, are absent. She dies alone except for the crowd that watches her burn. And yet, somehow, impossibly, her death changes nothing about what she accomplished. Orléans was relieved. The Dauphin was crowned. The English momentum was shattered. These facts persist regardless of how her story ends. A peasant girl who claimed to hear saints accomplished what experienced soldiers said was impossible. History will struggle for centuries to explain her, to fit her into comprehensible categories: visionary, military genius, fortunate fool, divine instrument. Perhaps she was simply someone who believed, absolutely and completely, in something beyond herself, and that belief, for a brief moment, bent reality around it. Or perhaps there's no explanation at all that satisfies. Perhaps she's simply a mystery, a reminder that history is stranger than we imagine, that individuals can matter in ways that seem impossible, that certainty is its own form of power. The war continues for another 22 years after her death. Gradually, relentlessly, the English are pushed out of France. Charles VII grows into his role as king. The French develop better artillery, better tactics, better administration. By 1453, only Calais remains in English hands. The 100 Years' War finally ends. Joan is never forgotten. Even before the war's conclusion, her reputation begins to shift. 25 years after her execution, a retrial is held at the request of her family and the king. The original verdict is overturned. She is declared innocent, a martyr wrongly condemned. Centuries later, she will be canonized as a saint. But on that May morning in Rouen, she's simply a young woman dying in fire, holding a crude wooden cross, calling out to a God she believed with perfect certainty had spoken to her. Whether he did or not, we cannot know. We can only observe that for a few months in 1429, the impossible became possible and a peasant girl changed history. Let that image fade now, the flames consuming, the crowd watching, the river flowing, the war continuing. All these events growing distant, becoming history, becoming stories told to help people understand how the world came to be as it is. We shift our focus now from human drama to something larger, slower, more inexorable. Let us consider the very air around those medieval lives, the warmth or cold of the seasons, the reliability or failure of the rains. Let us examine climate, not as backdrop, but as actor in the human story, shaping civilizations as surely as any king or army. The Earth's climate is not static. It breathes, in a sense, across centuries and millennia. Warm periods alternate with cool periods in rhythms that operate on timescales far beyond individual human lifetimes. To a peasant living through a single hard winter, the cold is simply misfortune, bad luck, perhaps divine punishment. But step back, view the pattern across centuries, and a different picture emerges. The cold is not random. It's part of a larger shift, a change in the fundamental mechanisms that govern weather across entire continents. Between approximately 950 and 1250 AD, Europe experienced what climatologists now call the medieval warm period, or medieval climate anomaly. The names are technical, bloodless, but the reality was vivid. Imagine, and you can let yourself simply imagine now, no need for precise detail, a Europe slightly warmer than the one you've been visiting tonight. Not dramatically so, not tropically, but warmer by perhaps 1 degree Celsius on average. 1 degree doesn't sound significant. 1 degree changes everything. In Greenland, during these centuries, Norse settlers established farms on land that today is too cold for agriculture. They raised cattle and sheep on coastal meadows. They built homes and churches, stone structures that still stand, empty now, abandoned when the climate shifted and the settlements became untenable. But during the warm period, life was possible there, even comfortable by medieval standards. In England, vineyards flourished much farther north than they do today. Wine production, which we associate with France and Mediterranean regions, extended into areas where modern viticulture would struggle. The growing season lengthened. Harvests became more reliable. Population expanded as agriculture supported more mouths. Across Scandinavia, the warming enabled the period we call the Viking Age. The Norse expansion to Iceland, to Greenland, briefly to North America, was facilitated by reduced sea ice, by more navigable northern waters. The famous longships could travel routes that would be perilous or impossible in colder periods. Trade networks stretched across vast distances because the ocean permitted it. In the Alps, the tree line, the elevation above which trees cannot grow, climbed higher on mountainsides. Glaciers retreated. Mountain passes that were buried in ice and snow became accessible for longer periods each year. Trade routes opened. Villages were established at elevations that would later be abandoned when the ice returned. The warming affected weather patterns across Europe. Precipitation increased in some regions, decreased in others. Storms shifted their paths. The changes were gradual enough that no single generation noticed the transition. But across 2 or 3 centuries, the accumulation was profound. This warmth, this climatic blessing enabled the High Middle Ages. Population grew, cities expanded, the great Gothic cathedrals were built, Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, massive undertakings that required surplus wealth, surplus labor, surplus food to feed the workers. Agriculture supported a more complex economy, trade flourished, universities were founded, intellectual and artistic achievements multiplied. It's not that the warm period caused these developments directly. History is rarely so simple, but the climate created conditions in which these developments became possible. Reliable harvests meant fewer famines. Fewer famines meant larger, healthier populations. Larger populations meant more labor, more trade, more specialization of skills. The climate provided the foundation upon which medieval civilization built its most impressive structures. But climates shift, always, inevitably, they shift. Around 1300, the warming period ended. The transition was not abrupt. Climatic changes rarely are. But over decades, over generations, the average temperature began to decline. The shift inaugurated what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures that would persist with variations until approximately 1850. The cooling brought dramatic consequences. In Greenland, the Norse settlements began to fail. The growing season shortened. Fodder for livestock became scarce. Resupply ships from Iceland and Norway came less frequently as pack ice made the journey more dangerous. By the early 15th century, the settlements were abandoned. When later explorers visited the sites, they found empty houses, empty churches, the remains of a civilization that had simply ceased. The glaciers in the Alps advanced, grinding down mountainsides, covering meadows and pastures that had been productive during the warm period. Villages were buried or threatened. Passes that had been opened closed again. Trade routes were severed or became far more difficult to traverse. In England, the vineyards failed. The growing season was too short, too cold. Wine production shifted back south, concentrating in regions where it remains today. The English would never again produce wine in the quantities they had during the medieval warm period. But these were peripheral effects, noticeable primarily in marginal environments. The real impact was felt in the agricultural heartland of Europe, in the fields where wheat and rye determined whether populations ate or starved. The cooling brought increased weather variability. Summers became shorter and wetter, springs arrived later, autumns turned cold earlier. The growing season contracted, sometimes by weeks, sometimes by more. For crops like wheat that require specific conditions and timing, this contraction was catastrophic. The first major sign of the new climate regime came in 1315. That year, rains began in spring and barely stopped. Fields flooded, seeds rotted in waterlogged soil. What crops did manage to germinate grew weak and thin, vulnerable to disease. The harvest that autumn was disastrous. One bad harvest can be endured barely if reserves from previous years exist. But 1316 brought more rain, and 1317, 3 successive years of crop failure. The reserves ran out. What followed was the Great Famine, one of the worst demographic catastrophes of the medieval period. Between 1315 and 1322, An estimated 10 to 15% of Europe's population died of starvation and related diseases. The number is impersonal, perhaps 7 million people. The reality was millions of individual deaths, millions of families watching children waste away, millions of communities disintegrating under the pressure of hunger. The chronicles from the period are difficult to read even now, centuries later. They speak of people eating bark, grass, acorns, anything remotely digestible. They speak of parents abandoning children because they couldn't feed them. They speak in veiled language of worse things still, of boundaries crossed that should never be crossed, of hunger so extreme it destroyed the social bonds that define humanity. The famine ended eventually, not because conditions improved, but because so many had died that the remaining population could be supported by reduced harvests. Equilibrium was restored through death. The climate shift was not just about cold, it was about unpredictability. During the medieval warm period, weather patterns had been relatively stable. Farmers could anticipate the seasons, could plan based on generations of accumulated knowledge. Now that knowledge became unreliable. A mild spring might be followed by a frigid summer. A dry autumn might give way to a winter of unprecedented snow. The rhythms that had governed agricultural life became chaotic. This unpredictability made life precarious in ways that extended beyond mere discomfort. Remember the peasant we encountered earlier, whose existence depended on successfully bringing in his harvest. Now imagine that same existence, but the rules keep changing. The strategies that worked for your grandfather no longer work. The timing that was reliable becomes treacherous. You plant when tradition says to plant, but the spring stays cold and the seeds don't germinate. Or you wait, hoping for warmth, and then summer arrives suddenly, violently hot, and your planting window has closed. The cooling also altered disease patterns. Certain crop diseases thrive in cool, wet conditions. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, produces alkaloids that cause horrific symptoms when consumed: convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene. During the warmer centuries, ergot was relatively rare. As the climate cooled and moisture increased, ergot poisoning became more common. Entire villages could be affected, their bread tainted, their population afflicted with symptoms that seemed demonic. The changing climate stressed societies that were already under pressure. Remember, we're discussing the same period as the 100 Years' War, the same period when plague arrived in 1347. The climate was one factor among many, but it was a constant background pressure, making everything harder, making recovery from other disasters more difficult. How do we know these things? How can historians and climatologists speak with confidence about temperatures and weather patterns from 700 years ago? The evidence comes from multiple sources, each providing a piece of the larger picture. Ice cores are perhaps the most dramatic source. In Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill deep into ancient ice sheets, extracting cores that preserve a record of past atmospheres. Snow falls year after year, century after century, compacting into ice. Tiny air bubbles trapped in that ice contain samples of the atmosphere at the time the snow fell. Chemical analysis of these bubbles reveals information about temperature, about atmospheric composition, about volcanic activity that cooled the planet through ash and sulfur. The ice cores from Greenland show the medieval warm period clearly, a sustained period when oxygen isotope ratios indicate warmer temperatures. They show the transition to the Little Ice Age, the cooling trend that begins around 1300. The record is precise, datable, scientific. Tree rings provide another window into past climates. Trees add one growth ring per year, and the width of that ring reflects growing conditions. A warm summer with adequate moisture produces a wide ring. A cold, dry summer produces a narrow ring. Ancient trees, living trees that are centuries old, and preserved wood from even older specimens, can be analyzed ring by ring, creating a timeline of growing conditions stretching back more than 1,000 years. European oak timbers from medieval buildings, from ships, from archaeological sites, all tell the same story. Wide rings during the medieval warm period, narrowing rings as the cooling begins, particularly narrow rings in the years of the Great Famine, when growth was minimal. Historical documents, though less scientific, provide human texture to the climatic data. Chronicles mention unusual weather events, severe winters, late frosts, heavy rains. Tax records show crop yields rising and falling. Church records document famines and their human cost. Estate records from manorial farms track harvest sizes year by year. Merchant records show wine production moving south as northern regions become unsuitable. These different sources, ice cores, tree rings, historical documents, corroborate each other. They create a consistent picture of climatic change, of a warm period ending and a cool period beginning, of profound impacts on medieval society. The Little Ice Age wasn't uniformly cold. Like all climate periods, it had variations, decades of relative warmth, followed by decades of harsh cold. But the overall trend was toward cooler temperatures, toward more challenging agricultural conditions, toward a world that was harder to survive in than the one that had preceded it. Particularly severe cold snapped in during the mid-15th century, the late 16th century, and the mid-17th century. During these periods, rivers that rarely froze became icebound. The Thames in London froze solid multiple times, allowing frost fairs to be held on the ice, carnival-like events that seemed charming in retrospect, but represented severe disruption to trade and transportation. Alpine glaciers advanced to their maximum extent in recorded history, destroying villages and farms that had existed for centuries. The social impacts were profound. Crop failures contributed to social unrest. Hungry populations are unstable populations. The German Peasants' War of 1524-1525, while sparked by religious and political factors, unfolded against a background of economic stress exacerbated by poor harvests. The witch hunts that swept Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries correlates with periods of climatic stress. Communities under pressure sought explanations for their misfortunes, and scapegoating intensified. The Little Ice Age also affected warfare and politics. Armies require food, vast quantities of it, and campaigns were often limited by the availability of supplies. Cold, wet summers meant reduced harvests, which meant reduced ability to support military operations. The economic stress of poor harvests constrained royal revenues, limiting the ability to wage war. Climate was never the sole factor in historical events, but it was consistently present, shaping possibilities, constraining options. In North America, the cooling affected indigenous societies. The Vikings, who had briefly settled in Newfoundland around 1000 AD, abandoned their settlement, partly because conflicts with indigenous peoples made it untenable, but also because the cooling made the environmental conditions more challenging. The growing season shortened, making the settlement less viable economically. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan cultures experienced severe drought periods that correlate with Little Ice Age effects. The great settlements at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde were abandoned in the late 13th century, likely due to a combination of factors, including climatic stress. The elaborate agricultural systems that had supported these populations became insufficient as rainfall patterns shifted. Globally, the Little Ice Age had varying effects. In China, the Ming dynasty faced challenges from crop failures and economic stress. In India, monsoon patterns shifted, affecting agricultural productivity. The climate was not changing uniformly. Some regions experienced cooling, others drying, others increased precipitation. But the overall pattern was one of increased climatic stress during this period. The Little Ice Age finally ended in the mid-19th century as temperatures began to rise again. The timing coincides roughly with the Industrial Revolution, and indeed, human greenhouse gas emissions would eventually become a major driver of climate change. But the end of the Little Ice Age began before industrial emissions became significant, suggesting that natural climatic cycles were also at play. Today, we live in a period of rapid warming, unprecedented in its speed, if not its ultimate magnitude. The medieval experiences with climate change, both the warming and the cooling, offer perspective. Climate shapes human civilization profoundly. It creates possibilities and forecloses them. It enables prosperity and causes suffering. And it operates on timescales that can make it invisible to individual experience while being obvious across generations. The peasant we met earlier, struggling through the 100 Years' War, experienced the effects of climate change without ever knowing what climate change was. He knew that harvests had become less reliable than his grandfather said they once were. He knew that winters seemed harsher. He knew that hunger was a more frequent visitor than the old stories suggested it should be. He experienced the consequences without understanding the cause. And perhaps that's the final lesson from this exploration of medieval climate. The largest forces shaping our lives are often invisible to us in the moment. We experience effects while the causes remain hidden, operating at scales too large or too slow for direct perception. Only later, only with distance and perspective and the patient accumulation of evidence, do the patterns become clear. Let that understanding settle now. The slow shift of climate across centuries, the advance and retreat of glaciers, the subtle change in growing seasons that meant the difference between plenty and famine, all of it operating according to laws that medieval people could neither understand nor control, shaping their lives as surely as any human force, perhaps more surely. We turn now from fields and battlefields, from climate and catastrophe, to something quieter, more cerebral. Let us enter the world of medieval scholarship, the realm of ideas and disputations, of Latin texts and theological debates. Let us visit the University of Paris in the 14th century, when it stood as one of Europe's most prestigious centers of learning, attracting students from across Christendom. Picture Paris itself first. The city sprawls along both banks of the Seine, perhaps 100,000 souls crowded within its walls and spilling into suburbs beyond. The river flows through the center, dividing the city into distinct quarters. On the right bank lie the markets and merchants, the bustle of commerce. On the Île de la Cité, the island in the river's center, stands Notre Dame Cathedral, its Gothic towers reaching toward heaven. And on the left bank, the southern bank, lies the Latin Quarter, so called because Latin is the language spoken there, the universal tongue of scholarship. Imagine yourself as a student arriving in Paris for the first time. You're perhaps 14 years old, young by modern standards, but typical for the period. You've come from a town in England or Germany or Italy, traveling for weeks to reach this city of learning. Your family is not wealthy. True wealth would destine you for other paths, but comfortable enough to spare you from labor, to afford the fees and living expenses that studying requires. You are literate, already educated in basic Latin grammar, able to read though perhaps not yet fluent. The Latin Quarter greets you with noise and density. Streets are narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass abreast. Buildings lean toward each other overhead, blocking much of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight at street level even on sunny days. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, slick with moisture and waste. The smell is intense: human waste, animal waste, cooking fires, unwashed bodies, the particular odor of too many people living too close together. The university itself has no campus as you would recognize it. There are no university buildings in the modern sense, no central administration building, no library open to all students. Instead, the university is a collection of relationships and privileges, existing more as a concept than as a physical place. Masters, the teachers, rent rooms wherever they can find them. Students gather to hear lectures in rented halls, in churches, sometimes in private homes. The university is portable, intangible, defined by its members rather than its structures. You must find lodging. This is your first challenge. The city is expensive, and students are often exploited by landlords who know young scholars have few options. You share a room with 3 or 4 other students, sleeping on straw mattresses that harbor fleas and worse. The room is cold in winter. There's a fireplace, but fuel is expensive, and you ration it carefully. The room is stifling in summer. The window, unglazed, can be shuttered closed for warmth or opened for air, but never both simultaneously. Your possessions are few. A change of clothing, perhaps 2, a wooden bowl and spoon, writing materials, precious, expensive. Parchment is made from animal skins, laboriously prepared, and costs more than you can easily afford. You use it sparingly, writing small and tight, fitting as much text as possible onto each precious sheet. For practice and note-taking, you use wax tablets that can be smoothed and reused, or scraps of parchment already written on, the margins still blank. Books are impossibly expensive. A single manuscript hand-copied by a scribe might cost more than a year's living expenses. You will never own the books you study from. Instead, you listen to lectures where the master reads from his text and comments upon it, and you take notes trying to capture the essential points. Or you pay a small fee to consult books in the collections of churches or wealthy masters, reading quickly, copying passages you need. The curriculum you follow has remained essentially unchanged for centuries. It's based on the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 groups. First comes the trivium: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These are the foundational tools, the means by which you learn to think and communicate. Grammar is not mere syntax, but the deep study of texts, particularly Latin texts. Rhetoric teaches persuasion, the art of argument. Logic, dialectic, it's sometimes called, provides the frameworks for reasoning, for analyzing arguments, for constructing airtight positions. You've already studied these subjects at a basic level before arriving in Paris. Now, you study them deeply, spending years mastering the subtleties. You parse Latin texts word by word, analyzing grammatical structures, memorizing rules and exceptions. You practice composing speeches, learning the classical forms, studying examples from Cicero and other ancient authors. You work through logical problems, learning to construct syllogisms, to identify fallacies, to build arguments that cannot be refuted. The quadrivium comes next. Though many students never progress this far, it consists of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the mathematical arts. These subjects are studied not for practical application, but for their abstract beauty, for the way they reveal the divine order underlying creation. Numbers have mystical significance. Geometric ratios reflect heavenly harmonies. The movements of celestial bodies demonstrate mathematical perfection. Music is understood mathematically, as ratios and proportions that please the ear because they reflect cosmic order. The teaching method is distinctive, unchanged in its essentials since ancient times. You attend lectures where masters read from authoritative texts, Aristotle primarily, but also Boethius, Priscian, Euclid, depending on the subject. The master reads a passage, then comments on it, explaining obscure points, reconciling apparent contradictions, elaborating on meanings. You listen, you take notes, you memorize. Medieval education values memory highly. The ideal scholar has vast amounts of text stored in his mind, ready to be recalled and deployed in argument. You train your memory through techniques, associating ideas with physical locations, creating mental images, using rhythmic patterns. You recite texts aloud, alone in your cold room, the Latin words becoming so familiar they're almost thoughts rather than language. But the heart of university education is disputation, formal debate according to strict logical rules. Several times each week, you attend disputations where students and masters argue over questions posed by tradition or contemporary controversy. The format is ritualized. A question is proposed, whether the human will is free or determined by divine foreknowledge, for example, or whether universals exist outside the mind. One participant, often a student seeking his degree, argues the affirmative position. He marshals authorities, quotes from scripture and approved texts, constructs logical arguments. Another argues the negative, using the same tools to reach an opposite conclusion. The master presides, occasionally interjecting, testing arguments, pushing students to defend their positions more rigorously. You watch these disputations, learning the forms, absorbing the techniques. Eventually, you participate, standing before your peers and masters, feeling your heart race as you attempt to construct an argument that will withstand scrutiny. The process is intimidating, intellectually violent even. Your ideas attacked from every angle, your logic tested for any weakness. But it trains you to think with precision, to argue with rigor, to defend positions you may not personally hold simply for the sake of intellectual exercise. The 14th century is particularly exciting for scholars because of the relatively recent rediscovery of Aristotle's complete works. For centuries, medieval Europe had access only to fragments of Aristotelian thought, filtered through Latin translations of Arabic translations of the Greek originals. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, better translations became available. And suddenly scholars had access to Aristotle's complete philosophy, his logic, his physics, his metaphysics, his ethics. This created enormous intellectual ferment. Aristotle was pagan, writing centuries before Christ, yet his logic was undeniable, his system comprehensive and compelling. How to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology? Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, attempted a great synthesis, arguing that reason and faith were compatible, that Aristotle could be Christianized. But debates continued, schools of thought diverging. As a student, you're immersed in these debates. You study Aristotle's categories, his posterior analytics, his physics, his metaphysics. You learn his vocabulary, his methods, his ways of analyzing problems. You study the commentaries, layers of interpretation by Islamic scholars like Averroes, by Christian scholars like Aquinas, by your own masters who have their own interpretations to add. The intellectual world you inhabit is intensely hierarchical and authoritative. Truth is not discovered through experiment or observation, but through careful reasoning from established authorities. Aristotle and Scripture are the twin poles around which all thought organizes. When they seem to contradict, the task is to find the interpretation that reconciles them, not to reject either. The idea of questioning foundational authorities is barely conceivable. Progress in knowledge means better understanding of existing truths, not the discovery of new ones. Yet within these constraints, genuine intellectual creativity flourishes. Scholars develop increasingly sophisticated logical tools. They explore subtle distinctions, finding new ways to analyze old problems. The debates over universals, whether categories like redness or humanity exist independently or only in individual instances, generate insights that will echo through centuries of philosophy. The discussions of free will, of divine foreknowledge, of the relationship between faith and reason, grapple with genuinely difficult questions, and the answers proposed are often sophisticated and nuanced. Your daily life as a student follows certain rhythms. You wake early. The university day begins at dawn or before. You attend morning lectures, perhaps 2 or 3, standing or sitting on the floor of a rented hall, listening to masters read and comment on texts. There are no desks, no seats except what students provide for themselves. You stand for hours, shifting your weight, your back aching, trying to concentrate despite physical discomfort. Midday brings a break for the main meal, eaten at your lodging or purchased from street vendors. The food is simple: bread, pottage, occasionally fish or cheap meat. You eat quickly and return for afternoon lectures or disputations. Evenings are for private study, for review, for preparing for upcoming disputations or examinations. The work is relentless. There's always more to memorize, more to understand, more to prepare. In your cold, dim room, lit by expensive candles you can barely afford, you review your notes, mouthing Latin phrases, trying to commit complex arguments to memory. The university has tensions with the townspeople, the perpetual town-gown conflict that characterizes university cities throughout history. Students are young, often arrogant, frequently drunk, prone to violence. They enjoy certain legal privileges: exemption from many municipal laws, the right to be tried in church courts rather than secular ones. These privileges breed resentment among townspeople who must deal with student misbehavior but cannot punish it normally. Brawls are common. A student drinks too much in a tavern, insults a townsperson, punches a throne, knives are drawn. Sometimes these incidents escalate into larger conflicts: students against townspeople, street battles that leave people injured or dead. The university threatens to relocate entirely. This has happened before. Universities are portable, and Paris's privilege of hosting this institution can be revoked. The threat usually brings city authorities to negotiations, ensuring student privileges are maintained. Over time, colleges are established. These are not teaching institutions, but residential communities, essentially endowed dormitories where poorer students can live for free or reduced cost. The College of the Sorbonne, founded in 1253, is perhaps the most prestigious, housing students studying theology. Other colleges follow. These provide not just shelter, but community. A structured environment where students live together, eat together, study together, under the supervision of older scholars. If you're fortunate enough to gain admission to a college, your life improves substantially. You have a bed, not just a space on a shared floor. You have regular meals provided. You have access to the college's collection of books, perhaps the most valuable resource available. You study surrounded by other serious scholars in an environment designed to facilitate learning, rather than one where learning must compete with the chaos of ordinary urban life. The path to becoming a Master of Arts, the basic university degree, takes years. First, you must complete the trivial arts, demonstrating mastery of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. This requires passing examinations where you're questioned by masters, defending your understanding of texts, participating in formal disputations. If you pass, you become a Bachelor of Arts. As a bachelor, you continue studying, now focusing on the quadrivium or beginning to specialize in one of the higher faculties: law, medicine, or theology. After several more years, after more examinations and disputations, you can attempt to become a Master of Arts. The process is rigorous and expensive. You must pay fees to the university. You must host a feast for the masters who examine you. You must publicly defend a thesis in formal disputation, arguing against challengers who attempt to demolish your position. If you succeed, you're granted the licentia docendi, the license to teach. You are now a master, entitled to lecture, to take on your own students, to participate fully in university governance. For most students, this is the culmination of their studies. They leave Paris, returning to their home regions to teach in cathedral schools or to take positions in church or government administration. But for a few, the journey continues into the theology faculty, the crown jewel of the university. Theology is the queen of sciences, the highest form of knowledge, the study of God and divine things. The theology faculty is small, perhaps 20 or 30 masters, but its influence is enormous. These men advise popes and kings. They determine church doctrine. They settle theological controversies. To become a doctor of theology, the highest academic rank, takes a decade or more beyond the master's degree. The requirements are daunting: thorough mastery of Scripture, study of the Church Fathers, participation in countless disputations, lectures delivered to critical audiences, a final examination that can last days. The theology masters in the 14th century debate questions of profound subtlety. How does the Eucharist transform bread into Christ's body? What is the nature of divine grace? How does predestination reconcile with human free will? These questions have eternal significance in their worldview, and the answers proposed shape how millions of Christians understand their faith. You attend some of these theological disputations as a younger student, sitting at the back of the hall, watching in awe as masters deploy their formidable learning. The arguments move through layers of complexity, referencing obscure distinctions, quoting authorities in Greek and Hebrew and Arabic, constructing logical structures of dazzling intricacy. You understand perhaps a fraction of what's being argued, but you're witnessing the highest expression of medieval intellectual culture, the culmination of centuries of accumulated learning. The university operates within constraints we might find stifling. Intellectual inquiry is bounded by theological orthodoxy. Certain questions cannot be asked, certain conclusions cannot be reached, certain authorities cannot be challenged. Heresy is a genuine danger. Holding the wrong theological opinion can lead to excommunication, to loss of position, even to execution. The trial of Joan of Arc, conducted partly by university-trained theologians, demonstrates how theological learning can be weaponized. Yet within these constraints, the university preserves and extends knowledge. The works of ancient philosophers, which might otherwise be lost, are copied and studied. New generations of scholars are trained in rigorous thinking. The methods developed here, the careful analysis of texts, the formal disputation, the synthesis of diverse authorities, will shape European intellectual life for centuries. Your years at the university transform you. You arrive as a boy, barely literate, knowing little beyond your hometown's horizons. You leave as a man, fluent in Latin, trained in logic, capable of analyzing complex arguments, participating in an intellectual tradition stretching back to ancient Greece. You've learned to think in particular ways, to value certain kinds of knowledge, to see the world through frameworks provided by Aristotle and Scripture. But you've also learned other things, perhaps less formal but equally important. You've learned to live with discomfort, in cold rooms with insufficient food. You've learned to navigate a complex social world of students and masters, privileges and obligations. You've learned that knowledge is difficult, that understanding requires years of patient work, that truth is elusive, and arguments can be made for multiple positions. If you become a master yourself, you'll take your position in this great chain of transmission. You'll teach students as you were taught, reading the same texts, making the same arguments, passing on the same frameworks. You'll add your own commentaries, your own subtle interpretations, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. This is not a culture that values novelty for its own sake. This is a culture that values preservation, transmission, the careful maintenance of accumulated wisdom. The university's legacy extends far beyond the 14th century. The basic degree structure, bachelor's, master's, doctorate, persists today. The seminar method of education, where students read texts and discuss them with guidance from professors, echoes medieval lectio. The emphasis on rigorous argument, on defending positions against criticism, continues in modified forms. But in the 14th century, in the Latin Quarter of Paris, you're not thinking about legacy, You're thinking about the next lecture, the next disputation, the next examination. You're thinking about scraping together money for rent and food. You're thinking about the text you're struggling to understand, the argument you're trying to construct, the future that education might open for you. The bells of Notre Dame ring the hours, dividing the day into segments marked by prayer and study. The Seine flows past, indifferent to the intellectual labor unfolding on its banks. The city pulses with life, merchants and beggars, nobles and artisans, all existing in the same crowded space as this community of scholars pursuing abstract truths. And in this pursuing, in this patient, difficult work of learning and teaching, something remarkable is preserved and transmitted. The heritage of classical philosophy, the frameworks of Christian theology, the methods of logical analysis, all flowing from one generation to the next through the medium of the university, through young students like yourself absorbing what masters teach, eventually becoming masters themselves, continuing the chain. Let this scene fade now. The cold lecture halls, the formal disputations, the scratching of stylus on wax tablet, the murmur of Latin phrases being memorized, all of it fading into history, into the past that shapes our present without our always recognizing the connection. We've traveled far tonight, you and I. We've walked through muddy fields with a peasant whose name was never recorded, whose life was defined by struggle and loss. We've stood on the walls of Orleans, watching a teenage girl transform the course of history through sheer force of conviction. We've contemplated the slow shift of climate across centuries, the advance and retreat of glaciers marking changes far larger than any individual human drama. We've sat in cold lecture halls, wrestling with Aristotle's logic and theological mysteries, participating in an intellectual tradition that stretched across centuries. 4 segments, 4 windows into the medieval world. Each different, yet all connected by threads of shared experience, the constant proximity to death, the grinding difficulty of simple survival, the way hope could emerge even from desperate circumstances, the human capacity for both creation and destruction. If there's a theme connecting these explorations, perhaps it's this. The past was harder than we imagine, not harder in dramatic, cinematic ways, but harder in daily, grinding ways. Cold that never quite left your bones, hunger that was always present, fear that couldn't be escaped, ignorance of forces shaping your life, climate, disease, political decisions made far away by people who never considered your existence. And yet, people endured. They farmed and fought and studied and loved and raised children and found moments of joy even in circumstances that seem unbearable from our comfortable distance. They were not different from us in their fundamental humanity. They felt cold and hunger just as acutely. They loved their children just as fiercely. They hoped for better futures just as fervently. They were simply working with different constraints, different knowledge, different possibilities. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you do so in comfort that would seem miraculous to anyone we've encountered in these medieval explorations. Your room is warm or cool as you prefer, climate controlled to precise comfort. You're not hungry unless you choose to be. Food is abundant, varied, available without much effort. You're safe from violence, from the diseases that killed casually in medieval Europe, from the constant precariousness that defined life for most of human history. This is worth remembering, not to make you grateful in some simplistic way, but to provide perspective. The struggles we face are real, but they exist against a baseline of security and comfort unprecedented in human experience. We've solved problems that seemed unsolvable. We've tamed forces that seemed untamable. We've built a world where most people can expect to live full lifespans, can expect their children to survive, can expect to eat regularly and sleep safely. The past fades behind us now, becoming history once more, becoming stories we tell to understand how we arrived at this present moment. The peasant in his field, the girl with her banner, the glaciers advancing, the scholars disputing, all of them receding into the distance that time creates. Let them go. Let yourself release the weight of history, the accumulated suffering and struggle of centuries. It's not yours to carry, it's past. You're here, now, in this moment, in this comfort, in this safety. Your breathing is steady. The details of what you've heard tonight are already beginning to blur, to blend together, and that's exactly as it should be. There's no need to hold on to any of it. Let it all drift away, like smoke dissipating, like mist burning off in morning sun. The fields are empty now. The walls of Orleans are quiet. The glaciers rest in their slow, centuries-long dance. The Latin Quarter is silent. The disputations concluded. The scholars departed. And you can sleep. Sleep knowing that the struggles of the past are past. Sleep knowing that this moment is safe, is warm, is peaceful. Sleep knowing that whatever tomorrow brings, you face it from a position of security that most humans throughout history could never have imagined. The night is gentle around you. The darkness is comfortable, familiar. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to solve. Simply let yourself drift now, past the edges of waking thought, into the soft embrace of sleep. The history we've explored tonight will be there if you ever want to return to it, but for now, let it all go. Let everything go. Sleep well.